Okay, I believe we are live now. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alberto Villafan. I'm the digital producer at Sahan Journal. This afternoon, we are discussing how Hmong Minnesotans are facing new challenges as federal immigration enforcements are ramping up. I'm here with two guests to help us unpack what's been happening. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to go to my left. Caitlin, why don't you say hi and tell us who you are?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here and being part of this. My name is Katelyn Vue. I go by she, her, hers. I'm an immigration reporter at the Sahan Journal, and I've been at the Sahan Journal for almost 3 years now.
Thank you so much. And Mai, why don't you like to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm attorney Minding Moore. I have an office in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been practicing immigration law since 2007. I've been in the field since 2004, and we just primarily practice immigration at my office.
Thank you so much, Mai. And thank you both for your introductions and for joining us today. If you're just now tuning in and have questions for our guests regarding deportations and immigration for Hmong Minnesotans, feel free to ask them into our chat. My associate, Hannah, will be monitoring it throughout the day or throughout this conversation, and we'll be sure to ask them to our guests as they come in. Okay. A lot has happened in regarding immigration over the summer. In early June, at least 15 Hmong Minnesotans were arrested by federal immigration officers. And in August, about 5 Hmong Minnesotans were deported to Laos. Caitlin, you've been reporting on these arrests and deportations all year. Can you set the scene briefly about how the situation started and what's going on?
Yeah, like you said, there's been a lot that's been happening in immigration, and throughout the year, that's what I've been covering and what I've been trying to track. So, like you said, in June, we are aware of about 15 people in Minnesota being arrested by ICE and sent to detention facilities throughout Minnesota. We know that I think around a dozen were in Freeborn, and um, so yeah, that's been something that has been kind of crazy to follow. I've been in touch with families and hearing what they're going through, and just trying my best to keep track of everything.
Caitlin, would you mind speaking up for the rest of the broadcast just a
Yes.
little bit? You're good. No worries. Caitlin, early this year, two Hmong fathers were arrested at their homes. If I remember right, one of them was in front of their children and family. Uh, Tong Lao and Chai Neng Vu both had been checking in regularly with immigration court before their sudden arrests. Caitlin, why are these Hmong men being deported now? Has ICE given an explanation or any type of account?
Yeah, so a lot of the Hmong men that were arrested during the summer, they kind of have something in common where they had been convicted of past criminal violations in the past, like with Tong and with Ning. They had, um, you know, convictions that I like qualify for them to get final orders of deportation, and so that's what happened with a lot of these men. They get this order of final deportation from the federal government. But since for a really long time, Laos wasn't accepting U.S. deportees, that was why men like Tang and Ning were able to still remain in the U.S. after they were released from serving their sentence. And, with the um, President President Trump administration being so focused on trying to deport as many people as possible, they really pushed Laos to accept more deportees this year, which is why we're seeing this happen. And we're seeing this infected community that hasn't been affected like this before.
You're an attorney who serves immigrants applying for naturalization and represents them in immigration court. Are these deportations, the actions that we're seeing taken against Vu and Lao, are these typical?
So it's not typical in the Hmong community because, as Caitlin said, there's rarely ever travel documents issued for deportation to Laos. There's no formal repatriation agreement with Laos, and so for many, many years, this isn't something that we see in the Hmong community. We see it in a lot of different communities, but not particularly in the Hmong community. And so a lot of these folks, they have a final order of removal. The folks that are being rounded up and then getting deported already have a final order of removal. They are consistently checking in with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so then now that the U.S. has been able to effectuate removal and have been able to successfully pressure Laos into issuing travel documents, they're getting redetained for deportation.
And can you fill in the gaps where I'm wrong and correct me if I am? Hmong Minnesotans are also like, they don't have a state similar to like a Guatemalan Minnesotan or a Mexican Minnesotan. So how does that complicate the deportation process when we see people being sent to Laos?
So we are considered essentially stateless. However, a lot of the folks that are being deported because their parents are from Laos, citizenship law says that they are Laos citizens.
Okay.
And so as long as the Lao government is willing to issue travel documents, they're getting deported to Laos. And so keep in mind that some of these folks that are getting deported were not born in Laos. They were born in refugee camps in Thailand, but because there is no birthright citizenship, they were born in a refugee camp. They're considered Laos citizens and not Thai citizens, and so they're also getting deported to Laos.
Okay. So do we have any sense of like how many people in the Hmong and Lao communities could be swept up in these enforcement actions?
So there's no breakdown of like how many are Hmong and how many are Lao and how many are Mian and how many are other ethnic groups, but there's approximately 4,800 folks that have final order removals.
Okay. Thank you all for listening. If you were just now tuning in a little late, my name is Alberto Villafan with Sahan Journal. If you have any questions for today, we are discussing Hmong deportations in Minnesota. If you have any questions for our guests, feel free to ask them into their chat. Yeah. Sorry, I'm losing track of myself. I'm trying to like manage a couple things going on. So before this Instagram Live, we received a question from one of our little comments from at free.spirit Amy. Amy asked, what tangible actions can people take to protect Hmong Minnesotans and other immigrant communities impacted by these changes to immigration? We just heard from Mai, so I want to hear from Katelyn first, then we're going to follow.
Yeah, so like Mai was saying, that this hasn't really, like, there hasn't been this many people being deported to Laos before. Like, with the Hmong community and other communities, like, Laos hasn't historically rarely issued travel documents to accept deportees. And so what we're seeing happening now is a lot of the organizations, we're seeing like new organizations start. There's the Collective Freedom that is now trying to ramp up funding and efforts to support those that are being resettled and sent and deported to Laos. We're seeing Minnesota 8 also work hard to try to support this increase of families that are needing the resources now to kind of fill in for this person that they relied on so much as a breadwinner in their family. So, you know, there are organizations out there that are trying to increase efforts or ramp up to meet the needs of what the families have to go through now without this person in their life in the U.S., and also support those that are in Laos right now. And then yeah, I know that there have been families that have set up their own GoFundMes to try to help, you know, raise funds to support their family in Laos too.
Mai, I'm going to ask the same question to you. What is something tangible that people could do if they want to help, if anything?
So that's kind of a loaded question, right? It really depends on where individuals are in the process. I think that for folks that are afraid of being placed into removal proceedings because they're not U.S. citizens and they have been convicted of certain crimes, what we really want to do is start looking at, are these convictions removable? And so those are things where folks can work on gathering records and then seeing if there's anything that can be done to to try to prevent the deportation to occur in the first place. For folks that already have a final order of removal and haven't been picked up by immigration, are there things that we can do to try to reopen cases? Are there ways for us to either look at removing convictions that make someone removable, or just understanding what's going on with their case? And that includes getting a copy of their immigration file. And it's a big thing, because a lot of the time there's assumptions that are made without seeing the file, and once we review the file, we can see that there are different avenues of potential relief that is available. And so for a lot of folks that are scared and that are afraid, instead of just applying for citizenship, they should also consult an immigration attorney to see if they have convictions that are removable, or at the same time, if there's anything that can be done to try to reopen their case.
I've got a question from our chat real quick. This is from, one second, at Worthy Words. Minnesota 8 and others hosted a press conference recently and shared that we could pressure for more pardons to be given. Who do we pressure? We actually have a question related to this a little later in the show too. So
right now, I think that we're doing as much as we can, and the state is doing as much as they can to try to have more pardon hearings than they've ever had before. And so in the past, we've only had 2 pardon hearings a year, and now it's happening more frequently. And so I do believe that our state is aware of the circumstances that we're in. And there is a caveat to the pardons, though. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is that it doesn't forgive every single crime for immigration purposes. We have to look at what type of conviction it is and under which ground of removability it falls under. It's not a blanket, I go get a pardon and I'm fine, because it doesn't forgive like controlled substance violations or domestic violations or firearm violations. And so a pardon only gets rid of crime involving moral turpitudes and aggravated felonies. Anything aside from that, there's different grounds of removability under the Immigration Act that it's not going to help. And so it's not necessarily the go-to. And I think that that's the huge misconception right now, is that if I get a pardon, I'm saved. And that's not always the case. That's why it's so important for someone to obtain their immigration records, so that we can see which ground of removability the person was actually ordered removed under.
It's not as simple as just, here's a piece of paper, you're good, right?
Correct. And the main issue with that, too, is that if someone is pardoned and it doesn't assist them in their immigration case, at this point now, it's hard to go back to try to do post-conviction relief, because you can't really post-conviction something that you've already been forgiven for.
All right. So I'm going to add a little more context here. So in August, community members called for Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison to grant more pardons that could help Southeast Asians stay in Minnesota. First, I want to ask Katelyn, what kind of protections would a pardon even offer these men? And, how many people have even been granted a pardon, if at all?
Yeah. I think Mai did a good job answering a bit of that already. I know that when I went to that, press rally with Minnesota 8, they were hoping that with increasing the amount of times that Governor Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison meet to be able to decide on these pardons, with that increase of granting more pardons, that this could potentially help these Hmong Minnesotans that are facing deportation.
Real quick, Katelyn, again, can you speak into the microphone a little bit?
Yes.
Good. Sorry, did you have more you'd like to say?
No, that was it.
Mai, was there anything you wanted to add up to this?
Just keep in mind that Governor Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and then our Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, can only pardon Minnesota crimes. And so there are folks that are charged with federal crimes that they wouldn't be able to do a Minnesota pardon on. And then there are folks with criminal convictions outside of Minnesota that if they needed a pardon, that would have to happen in the state in which the conviction occurred.
Do we know how many Hmong Minnesotans have received pardons so far? You said 2 on average a year? Correct me.
No. There used to be 2 pardon hearings a year, and now there's a lot more. I think there's about 4 now, as opposed to just the 2.
Okay.
But I don't have a number on how many have been granted a pardon. I do know that I have a number of clients, though, that have received pardons.
Okay. Give me 1 second here. Sorry, I'm trying to orient myself still some more. Where is my page? We had a question that we received last night, actually. Can you pull that up for me, Hannah, real quick? We received an email from one of our guests, from an anonymous guest. They ask, could you please elaborate on whether there are specific provisions or policies within DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, for the potential release of a detainee who has not been deported within a particular time frame? And there's a follow-up to this. I'll ask you later.
So there isn't any specific provisions with DHS, but with in general with the federal government, we could file habeas petitions, and again, it just depends on where we're at with the process. And so, when to file will depend on if someone is getting redetained again, and we want to file so that we don't lose jurisdiction because folks get moved a lot, or if someone is just being detained for the first time. And so typically, it's 180 days, but it can be sooner than that. Again, it just depends on the situation. Every case is unique, and so it'd be hard to just provide a general response to that. And that's just a very attorney-like response, and I apologize for that.
I mean, there's only so much we can really say at this current moment. Then here was the follow-up to that. I'm going to have to adjust my microphone once more in a little bit. If such provisions exist, what are the criteria for consideration, and could such a release involve return to the community under specific conditions?
So again, we can always file a habeas petition to get the person released from custody. That doesn't mean, though, that the person wouldn't be deported. And so if for any reason the government is able to obtain a travel document at a later date, they can then redetain the individual for deportation. I think the purpose, again, it just depends on when you're filing, but the purpose really is that if the individual has been checking in routinely and ICE knows where the individual lives, as we've seen, they can come to pick up individuals at their house. They can come and get them at work. There are many places where the individual is readily available, and if there was a travel document issued, they could essentially just also send a call-in letter and have the individual come in for deportation. So there are methods available that ICE can use, and so that may be an argument in which we're seeking a habeas petition to get someone released. But again, if there is a potential of deporting, and if the government believes that they can deport the person fairly rapidly, it would be very difficult to get someone out.
So, if you are just now joining us, thank you so much. We are talking about the deportations of Hmong Minnesotans with Mai Nang Mua, managing attorney of the Mai and Mua Law Office, and Sahan Journal immigration reporter Katelyn Vue. If you have questions for our guests, please feel free to send them into the chat. So we've heard several stories of people being detained, and just, I guess I don't really have a full picture of what that process looks like. I'm gonna ask Katelyn and then could you guys walk me through what being detained looks like, or what being deported looks like?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say because I've had the opportunity to talk with some of the family and some of the men that are going through it, and they described to me that these arrests happen, in random times where, for example, Katelyn Vue, he attended his ICE check-in a week before he was arrested by ICE at his home, and so they weren't told ahead of time that that was going to happen. They were told at the ICE check-in that they were safe to go home and to come back and report in the next check-in. So they're not told ahead of time, even though they have this final order of deportation. It's been years since they've had that order. And so they happen at random times. It's happened in front of kids. And then they're quickly sent to Fort Snelling Immigration, a building in St. Paul where they're processed. And then they're sent to an ICE detention facility. And that can either be in Freeborn, Sherburne, or Candy, Ohio. And then they're detained there, and they're, when I was talking to Thong Lao, he was able to basically talk with the other Hmong men there, so they were all kind of detained together, and um, he told me that when they took away his cash card, he knew that his deportation was going to happen. And then it happened the next day. That was the last time I spoke with him. And I think it was his like second or final night in Minnesota before he was transferred. And they transferred him to a lot of different detention facilities in the country, mostly in the South. And um, yeah, and I was also talking to his wife and trying to keep track of where he is. There's the ICE detainee locator website, which you can try to like look up the person and find where they are, but that isn't always consistently updated. And so then, you know, sometimes they get the opportunity to be able to call their loved one and say the final goodbye. And then next thing I hear, they're in Laos.
So it's not even just a straight from Minnesota direct flight to Laos or something. It's bouncing
Yeah,
around.
definitely. They go through like a processing facility, like the I think Tao was in a processing facility in Laos. I mean, not Laos, Louisiana. He was held there for a bit with other Hmong men before he was finally put on a plane and deported to Laos.
Can you walk me through any other aspects of the deportation process that maybe she didn't cover?
So what Caitlin described is folks that already have a final order of removal.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those that do not have a final order of removal, they would be served with a notice to appear, which is a charging document in immigration proceedings. And those individuals do have an opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge and ask for relief. And a lot of the times, especially 10, 20 years ago, when the government wasn't able to deport to Laos, a lot of folks would just sign a final order of removal without even going to court or asking for any relief because they've been informed by friends or by others that if they signed the removal order, then the government would only hold them for 90 days after the order of removal, and they would then be released. And so then that's why folks got released into back into the community, and then they've been checking in for decades. And so, again, it just depends on where folks are at in the immigration process. If this is the first time, then usually you get a notice to appear. You get an opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge. You can hire an attorney at your own expense and try to fight out your immigration case. But if you already have a final order of removal, then what Caitlin has described is what we've been hearing from a lot of families is that folks will then get picked up because they already have a final order of removal. They are not entitled to a bond. They are not entitled to go in front of an immigration judge. And then they would be detained at a facility. They could get moved to different facilities before they're put on a plane to Laos.
I've got a question from a chatter real quick. Yep. First things first, are all 4,800 folks who are ID'd as removal, are they expected to be detained as they go in to meet their officer currently?
So what we've been hearing, though, is not everyone is getting detained at check-in. There are folks that do get detained at check-in, but not everyone is getting detained at check-in. And the reality is they may not be able to remove all of those folks, at least not this year or maybe not even next year, because a lot of the flights that have been going out, we've been hearing of, I think at most 150 individuals, and that's to Vietnam, but to Laos, we've been hearing of mostly less than 100 per flight. And so realistically, it's not feasible that the government would be removing that many individuals in this year or next year. It's possible that that can change, but from what we've been seeing, though, it's not that many.
Correct me if I'm wrong here again. I was to my understanding that Laos was in the past wasn't very cooperative with receiving deportees. Is that true?
That is true.
So what's changed?
A lot of it is just pressure, the U.S. pressure. There's also been the partial travel ban that was issued in June of this year, in which visas have been cut off to certain Lao individuals due to visa overstay and failure for Laos to accept deportees. And so it's a lot of pressure that's been put on the government.
Yeah, I remember when I spoke to the Lao embassy because, talking to Hmong Minnesotans affected by deportation, they kept saying, like, I call the Lao embassy every single day. Like, they know where he is. They know, when they've issued a travel document. And so I remember when I was speaking to, I think, one of the managers at the Laos embassy, um, he basically said that like they were being forced, like um, they can't refuse, like they can't refuse the, um, they they have to accept the U.S. deportees, and they just kept saying that like they have to, or else, it's a possibility that they could be sent to a whole different country than Laos, a country that they don't have any connection to at all.
Mm.
So they kept saying that, that is probably what families prefer, is that they're sent to a country where, it would be Laos instead of a country that possibly this person has like no ties at all whatsoever. So he kept saying that that's like the worst case. That's like the more worst case scenario. And so, yeah, that was what they said when I spoke with them.
That's heavy. Laos is quite literally the best, quote unquote, best case scenario in this situation.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
I've got another question from chat. What happens next if ICE doesn't deport a person before their TD expires? The TD for Laos is only valid for 90 days. Would ICE have to send another request to the Laos embassy to issue a new TD? And then can one of you guys also define TD for us?
So a TD is a travel document. Um, because a lot of these individuals do not have passports to Laos, the government are not able to deport unless they have travel documents. And so travel documents gets issued. I'm assuming that if a travel document was to expire, the Lao government would just ask, or the U.S. government would just ask the Lao government to reissue.
Okay. And then I've got another question here. I want to touch back on some of the deportees we've talked about. Katelyn mentioned that some of the Hmong deportees are being sent to Laos. Do we know how these deportees are doing? I
Mhm.
assume not great, but
Mhm. Yeah, well, so yes, like when they're in Laos, they get off the plane and they're usually sent to a facility where they're kept until they're officially processed. So they go through like rounds of interviews, and so they're not let out right away. They still have to go through more interviews with the Lao officials, and then eventually they have to find a sponsor. So at that point, they have to find someone who's a Lao citizen, and that can be a family member. It's also been sometimes um, like these advocacy groups I mentioned earlier, like Collective Freedom, trying to help find sponsors who are Lao citizens. And once they have a sponsor who will agree to be responsible, basically to help find them housing and get the deportee on the path to becoming a Lao citizen, then at that point they're released from the facility and they're kept just out in the community again.
and how smooth is that process to getting them to become a Laos citizen?
So I know that when they're in the facility that they're kept there. I think I've heard for a few months, but I don't know how hard it is for someone who is a deportee to secure Lao citizenship.
Thank you, Katelyn. And welcome to everyone who just joined us. We are here chatting with attorney Mai Nang Mua and Sahan reporter Katelyn Vue. We spent the start of the conversation talking about Katelyn Vue's reporting on Hmong Minnesotan men deported in August and how the deportation process works. Next, we'll discuss immigration concerns from Hmong and Southeast Asian communities and how they feel they should prepare themselves. If you have questions about this topic, feel free to ask them into the chat. We'll be sure to send them over to our guests as soon as we see them. Okay. So, since President Donald Trump took office, arrests of Hmong and Southeast Asians have increased, as well as the pressure to deport individuals to other countries. Can you tell us what concerns you're hearing right now from your Hmong and Southeast Asian clients?
So a lot of my clients, and then also those in the community, they're just scared. We have a lot of folks that are scared, especially those that already have a final order of removal. Those that don't have a final order of removal are also scared. But what I've been telling folks, though, is that the ones that are most at risk are the ones that already have the final order of removal, because the government can then just detain them at any time and ask for a travel document and then effectuate the removal. because for those that do not have a final order of removal but have removable offenses, those will have an opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge. And so if there is any relief available, those folks can seek relief at that time. Ultimately, essentially, we don't want folks just signing order removals, because now we know that that is a very possibility that they could be removed. And so if anyone has been issued a notice to appear, then they should look at whether or not there's any opportunity to be able to cancel that removal.
Katelyn, I don't know if we probably shouldn't name specifics, but what have you been hearing from interviewees, from people you've been talking to in the community?
Yeah, the same thing. Like Mai said, there's a lot of fear. I think there's a lot of like misconceptions too. Like I mean, it took me a while, and I feel like a lot of people in the community have also had this question about coming here as a refugee and then now facing deportation. Like, I think it was hard for me to wrap around like how coming to the U.S. as a refugee, like then now facing deportation and how that's possible. And so I think a lot of people have that kind of question as well, like, coming to the US as a refugee and how they can later on be deported to Laos. So, yeah, there's misconceptions about that. I think some people don't quite understand, when I was talking to Xiaoning, he talked about his conviction, and he also talked about, all of his degrees and his kids and his hobbies and how he tries to be a positive influence on his kids. And so I just feel like there's a lot that I feel that, I don't know, there's just like so much complexity, I think, to try to understand it at the same time. So I think the fear and like the confusion is valid.
Mike, can you help me understand like what protections a refugee might have, if any?
So, piggybacking off of what Caitlin was just saying, what a lot of folks don't understand is that if you're not a U.S. citizen, the immigration law can still impact you. And so, for a lot of folks in our community, if they have a green card or if they haven't even applied for a green card, then they can still be subject to removal with certain criminal convictions or stuff like that. And so a lot of the times people think, well, then I can just go and apply for citizenship. And if I then become a citizen, I can't be deported. But a big problem with that right now is that if you get denied citizenship and you have removable offenses, then the government will issue a notice to appear and you are now in immigration court.
And I have family who have applied for citizenship, so I know it's not an easy process, but how long does it typically take to become a U.S. citizen?
So right now, it is very quickly. We've been seeing cases get interviewed in 3 to 6 months, and so it's been moving pretty quickly.
Really?
But again, with that being said, the caveat is if folks have any type of criminal convictions or anything like that, again, you have to be able to show that you're a person of good moral character. And a lot of the times, people will come to me and say, "Well, I don't understand why I wasn't approved. I passed the test." Well, passing the test just meant that you understood you knew the civic questions, you can read and write in English, but you also have to be a person of good moral character.
What does that mean? Because I remember, Caitlin, you recently wrote a story
Yeah.
about this expansion, or I guess new caveat. How do we define good moral character?
Yeah, I think that when I wrote the story about US citizenship, so now there's changes to the civics test too. They're adding about 28 questions to the test. So a lot of, so the immigrants applying to become US citizens have a lot more that they need to study and prepare. But also they've added a couple of guidelines for USCIS officers to evaluate good moral character. So it used to be, like, I guess before the August USCIS. So this just happened. So it used to be in the past that they would only measure good moral character. Usually, if you didn't comply with taxes or you had a criminal conviction or a criminal violation, they used to just look at all the negative attributes, but then now they're informing USCIS officers to look at it more affirmatively. So actually looking for more evidence from immigrants who want to become U.S. citizens by now they're asking for more letters of recommendation. Um, they're also asking for like, for example, like folks can provide like volunteer service. They're asking for paying for child support and all those things. So there's, I think, a higher standard now that USCIS officers are instructed to now follow to measure that moral character.
That sounds a lot like when I was applying for college. I'm not gonna lie.
Mm-hmm.
But like a letter of recommendation is, guess what I'm hung up on. Like, what does that necessarily mean? I'm just gonna use a hypothetical. Can I just write you, Caitlin, and say like, yeah, she's nice, she's very kind.
Mm-hmm.
Simple as that, or
Yeah, so I think they usually ask from employers. I think now they're introducing neighborhood investigations, so they're like looking back at, folks that you have been in touch with in the past 5 years. They are also asking that if attorneys that I've talked to who help with um, folks apply for U.S. citizen have told me that now they're telling their clients who are applying that they will need a letter of recommendation if they have anything as small as like a traffic violation. So they'll want someone to kind of advocate for this person applying that they're a rehabilitated person.
thank you, Caitlin. I appreciate that. So, I know you're not able to offer specific legal advice here or discuss clients that you're representing, but could you maybe talk about how community members should prepare themselves in the event of immigration action?
So I think it depends on how we define that, right? How is immigration action defined? If we're talking about applying for affirmative, like benefits, that's just what Caitlin was just talking about, is when you're applying for citizenship, that's applying for a benefit. Applying for a green card, that's applying for a benefit. And so when an individual is applying for a benefit, the burden of proof is on the individual. When the government is trying to deport someone, the government has the initial burden of proof to show that this individual who is a permanent resident is removable because of this conviction under the immigration statute. This conviction is what makes someone removable. And so it's hard for me to kind of tell folks how to prepare themselves without understanding the context of what we're fully discussing. But if we're talking about in the sense that your client or your family member already has a final order of removal, there are a lot of folks that it's very difficult for them to accept that. There are certain crimes that are so egregious that no matter how many years have passed, there's nothing we can do about it. And for those in that situation, usually what we tell them is prepare a power of attorney in case someone was to be detained. Work together a safety plan of what's going to happen with your kids, what's going to happen. If you're checking in, make sure you have someone that goes with you. And so if you were detained, they can take your car keys, they can take your wallet. There are things that they can take and then inform other family members that this has happened. Make sure you know their alien number, because that's what you're going to need to locate where the individual is. But most importantly, if you don't have their immigration file and you don't understand the immigration background, request a copy of the file. If folks haven't been detained yet and they have potential removable offense, work with an attorney to see if there's any way that we can make that removable offense either go away or change it to something that is not removable.
And Caitlin, I'm sure you've heard similar concerns when you're reporting on these immigration cases, but what trends and patterns are you seeing within the court system, within communities?
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing that I think a lot of the Hmong deportees that are in Laos right now, I'm seeing that there's an increase of them there, and that there's resources that, there's like advocacy groups that are trying to ramp up efforts to create enough infrastructure there so that when they're released from the facility that they're prepared to start their new lives. And I'm seeing an increase of arrests that have been happening, and I think many more in the community are asking these questions around immigration that they haven't asked before. And yeah, those are some of the couple of things I've been seeing.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Mai. And thank you to everyone still joining us. For anyone who's just now popping in, we are talking about changes to immigration policy impacting Hmong and Southeast Asian communities in Minnesota. We're getting kind of close to the end of our broadcast. We got 20 minutes left, so please feel free to ask any questions you do have regarding the process in chat. Speaking of, I've got one from a chatter real quick. This is from 26 Little Letters. They say, I work with many Hmong folks who have lost their documents. How harmful is it FOIA? How harmful is it if they have their immigration records or I-94? Sorry, I'm dyslexic. I've never actually learned how to properly read.
That's okay.
How harmful is it FOIA, their immigration records, or I-94 / if they have criminal records? That makes sense, Mai.
It does make sense.
Okay.
The FOIA is the FOIA request. It's under the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of folks are concerned that by requesting their record, it's going to trigger immigration to come to their door and pick them up or something like that. And what I tell folks is that they can come and get you at any time. It's not difficult for immigration to find someone, especially because a lot of these folks with a final order of removal have employment authorization. They're working, they're paying taxes, they're checking in regularly, and so it's not difficult for immigration to locate them if they wanted to. It's better to have a copy of your file so that we can start working on, is there anything that can be done, versus not knowing what's happening and continuing to live in limbo.
I know for clients you see go through immigration court, what do they typically have in common? Like, what is their through line? What's their experiences that you may see frequent in between them? Does that make sense?
Not quite.
I guess I'm asking, like, what's some of these common experiences? What do you typically see between these people that, like, it's the same issues that they may keep experiencing?
So it's hard because a lot of the folks that came here, they don't really understand the law because they may come here when they were older or they came here very young, but their parents aren't able to really teach them anything because the parents don't understand the law. The parents doesn't really speak much English at all. And so they're kind of growing up and trying to straddle both worlds, living at home with their parents, trying to understand the Hmong community, the Hmong culture, the Hmong language, and then having to go to school trying to learn English. And a lot of them are they make mistakes because they don't really have the proper guidance.
So I guess, how often do you also find yourself playing teacher in these cases?
I spend a lot of time preparing my clients for that, for court. Essentially, it's just understanding, first and foremost, we started out with, what you should wear to interviews or to court. Essentially, I have to tell them you need to dress up as if you're going to a job interview. We talk about how do they talk to the judge, how do they address the government attorney, eye contact, because a lot of the time it's not normal to provide eye contact, especially in the community, because a lot of folks, they get nervous or they don't believe that they should be looking at someone, and so they're not providing eye contact. But in the greater community, you're supposed to, and because it goes to credibility. And so then we work on just understanding the basics of conduct in court, what you can say, what you shouldn't say, how to say it, how to address it, what you should wear. Those are things that we always start with in preparation.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. I've got another question from chat. This is from HCW4P Twin Cities. How can healthcare workers be helpful? Medical records are also legal documents, and are there harmful things we should avoid in how we document? Can physicians write letters that help in any way?
So when I'm working with clients and I need letters from doctor, it's just really to confirm diagnoses. And again, it depends on which context I'm using it in. If we're talking about a medical waiver, so because someone isn't able to understand English, they are not able to read and write due to a medical disability, then we would want a letter, and they would have to complete a form that shows that the person's diagnosis is what prevents the individual from being able to learn how to read, write, and understand so that they could still apply for citizenship. But if we're also looking at it in terms of a waiver or in terms of asking for cancellation or removal, in which we're showing that there's hardship to family members, really it's just in the form of we want records to confirm that the individual, the family member, have certain types of like diagnoses and what medication they're taking for it. And so again, it just depends on which context we're using it in.
Thank you, Mai. So we have seen that immigration policies in the United States right now are changing at an extremely rapid pace. I'm curious, Katelyn, where do you see things headed next for Hmong Minnesotans? What's our next change, or what's the fate here?
Yeah, well, I've talked to some Hmong legislators, and I think that what I can see happening in the future is that, I know that there was there was like some alarm in the community when these arrests started to happen. I think folks started to ask these questions. It was like the fear was like really fresh when these arrests happened. But now we're seeing that like deportation can happen from the moment they're arrested, and we're seeing them arrive in Laos. So I think what's happening next is just trying to think about how we can help the families that are going through this. What kind of resources do they need, or how can we help them be in order to stop a deportation that's happening. So just preparing them, and then I think also there's more need around trying to build infrastructure. The resources, the workshops, the training, the preparation that goes into helping someone resettle when they're released back in Laos after going through deportation. So I really think that that's going to be something that we see happen next, and I think that more Hmong legislators are being involved in it as well. So I think that we're possibly going to see more push towards policy, or Hmong legislators coming together to discuss this topic even more in depth.
And I guess what are legislators saying to you? Like, what is their plan if they have one?
Yeah, well, I know that they are in touch with one another. The Hmong legislators in Minnesota, they're aware of this happening, and they're they're talking with folks in the community. But I think that a lot of folks also understand that it's a very complex immigration system, and that to be able to prevent a deportation can be rare or very difficult to do. And so I know that among them, they're just trying to help build resources in the community to be prepared.
Thank you. We have about like 10 minutes left in our broadcast. Thank you guys so much for hopping in today. If there are any more questions in our chat regarding the deportation of Hmong and Southeast Asians in Minnesota, please feel free to send them in. We've only got 10 minutes left. We want to hear from you. Speaking of, I've got one more from chat. Is there a process for the deportees to return to the U.S. after this administration? Katelyn, I think I want to hear from you first, real quick.
I think that's a really good question. You know, I I don't really know much about that, to be honest. I think that yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't really know.
We're going to bounce that over to Mai.
I think it would be very difficult because when you think about it, folks are being deported because of criminal convictions for the most part. The ones that we're dealing with in our community came here as refugees, and they then adjusted their status and have become permanent resident. And so a lot of them lost their green card because of criminal convictions. Criminal convictions are grounds of removability, and they are also grounds of inadmissibility. And what that means is that it also prevents them from being able to come back into the U.S. And so it is very difficult. Again, it depends on the conviction. There are certain convictions, especially the drug offenses. Those are the most difficult ones, I think. The drugs and the firearms are very, very difficult offenses in which there is no waiver available. And so if someone has been convicted of a crime and they have been deported and now they're trying to come back, it's very difficult to get a waiver to come back. And then when you look at the non-immigrant waiver, where it's a much easier, but it's also very difficult to get a non-immigrant visa approved, like a visitor visa. I can't fathom the government agreeing to let someone come back to the U.S. to visit their family when they've lived here almost their entire life. And so That kind of goes back to the travel ban. It's because a lot of folks overstay their visa and they don't go back home, and so it's very difficult to believe that someone who has been deported is going to come visit and then go back to Laos.
So it's not even starting back at square one. It's you don't even get to play the game anymore. It's over.
I think it's very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible because we have been able to bring someone back from Cambodia, but it's very difficult.
So,
Again, every case is different, though. It's on a case-by-case analysis. That's a very general response. And there are folks that are a lot more optimistic than I am. And then there are also folks that won't let up on me, that pushes me to also become very optimistic.
what's stopping your optimism, I guess?
I think it's just seeing so much of the negative around us and then not being able to do much to be able to stop what's happening. And so it's hard when I'm so realistic, and I try to be very realistic with my clients because I don't live in the ideal world anymore because I see results from actions that's been happening. And so it makes it very difficult for me to just be idealistic with my clients.
Thank you, Mai. This is probably our last question of the show. I want to thank you guys both so much for giving me your time and bearing with me as we experience some technical difficulties. As things are changing rapidly, we're seeing a lot of misinformation and disinformation spreading pretty quickly on social media. I want to take this time with you to maybe clear up some common misconceptions you're hearing about deportations. Is there anything that you're hearing that you just want to make sure people have proper and clear, correct information?
So again, it goes back to if someone already has a removal order, if they don't. Not impossible is not always in my vocabulary either. And so if someone has not been detained yet, that is the best way for us to start, where we want to look at their background. We want to look at their immigration file to see if there's anything that can be done. Sometimes we are able to successfully reopen and terminate proceedings because we've been able to work on what made the individual removable. And we've just had 2 cases in the last 2 weeks where we were able to reopen and terminate proceedings on. And so it is very possible, especially for folks that haven't been detained yet. If folks have been detained and removed, again, we want to look at what is the underlying crime. There are crimes that are more forgivable than others. Property crimes, those are essentially the most forgivable crimes, especially if they're 20 years old, 30 years old. And so I wouldn't necessarily write someone off yet just because they have a final order of removal.
It's not an end-all, be-all. Katelyn, are there any misconceptions you would like to clear up before we turn off our mics?
Not really. I don't think so. I think like the point I mentioned earlier about like coming here as refugees, I think some folks, I think when I talk with folks about like deportation in the community, that's one of the first things they ask me. It's like, but what about if you came as a refugee? And I think, me and Mai talked about how that doesn't protect you from, facing deportation later on in life. And so I just say that's another thing I keep, asking people to try to understand.
Thank you guys both so much for giving me your time. Is there anything else we would like to share with our broadcast before we sign off? I'm seeing shaking heads. All right. Well, we are at the end of our Instagram Live. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our fantastic guests, Maya and Katelyn, so much. After this live, we're going to have a full conversation available on our YouTube. Yeah. If you have any more questions, feel free to email us or comment them down below. We should have a lot more information for you coming out, and make sure to stay up to date with the latest in immigration news from Sahan Journal, specifically our immigration reporter, Katelyn Vue. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day.